This is an extremely important event, but I want comrades to understand that really the events in Germany from 1918 to 1923 represent some of the most decisive periods in all of human history. The fact that the workers of Germany did not come to power doomed the Russian Revolution to national isolation and made possible the rise of Stalinism. And also, in Germany, the failure of multiple waves of revolution to solve the contradictions of capitalism led eventually to the rise of Nazi fascism, the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War. And as I hope to make clear today, none of this was inevitable. The German workers had every opportunity to win, but this opportunity was missed. And this is why the German Revolution is, for us, not only of historical importance. Every revolution has its particular features, but there are certain patterns and dynamics that are common to all revolutions. And by studying these dynamics and by drawing the necessary lessons, we're also preparing ourselves so that when our opportunity comes, we will be ready. And studying the German Revolution is also important because it occurred in an advanced capitalist country. Germany at the start of the 20th century was the country in which the prospects for the victory of socialism were both the closest and the most realistic. It had abundant natural resources of coal, which was the basis of an industrial economy at that time, and had undergone an extremely rapid demographic expansion. By 1913, Germany had a population of almost 70 million people, about 2/3 of which were working class and lived in big cities. And it was a very advanced economy. It held first place in Europe in terms of iron production. It had an advanced chemical industry. And it was the first European state to harness the power of electricity and the internal combustion engine on an industrial scale. And the German economy also serves as a model for the imperialist phase of capitalist development. The economy was dominated by giant syndicates and trusts. The coal syndicate controlled 90% of coal production. And the mines, blast furnaces, rolling mills, and metalworking plants were all integrated into these gigantic, vertically integrated corporations. The fusion of banking capital with industrial capital was more complete than anywhere else except for maybe the USA. And the banks dominated economic activity. And most of this banking was concentrated in just 5 establishments in Berlin. And so the concentration of this economy in this way would have made possible the setting up of a socialist planned economy within a relatively short period of time. And on top of this, the German proletariat had nothing in common with the immature and illiterate proletariat which filled the factories at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. German workers were fairly well educated, familiar with technology and machines, and with a sense of collective work and responsibility and a real taste for organization. And the expression of this was above all the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or the SPD. And I hope I can convey how powerful of a party this was. It was a mass Marxist party that had actually been constructed on the foundations set by Marx and Engels themselves. By 1914, the SPD had more than 1 million dues-paying members. In the legislative elections in 1912, its candidates had over 2 million members. On its 90 daily newspapers, the party employed 270 full-time journalists and more than 3,000 other employees. And it really encompassed almost the entirety of the workers' movement. And it was really the model throughout the International. The Bolsheviks in Russia regarded themselves as really no more than a faction that was constructing a social democratic workers' party like the German one. Now, the incredible success of the SPD in Germany also had, I guess we could say, social consequences. There had been a prolonged economic boom and a general increase in the standard of living from the 1870s all the way to around 1908, as German imperialism was still expanding. This is a period, I think, in many ways very similar to the post-war boom of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But in this period at the beginning of the 20th century, it was in that period that the SPD took massive strides, winning really victory after victory. It built the powerful trade unions, which won real concessions from the bosses who could afford better wages and working conditions. And they even won the beginnings of a welfare state with health insurance, accident insurance, old age pensions. And the fact that life was getting better under capitalism, especially for the upper layers of the workers' movement, had an effect. This got to the heads of the leaders and the functionaries of the SPD, who developed a bit of the psychology, that, maybe we can just keep going like this. Maybe Marx and Engels got a little carried away with their revolutionary zeal. And this is really the outlook of reformism, of an adaptation to capitalism. This was given a theoretical expression by a man named Edvard Bernstein. And he based himself on his observations that over the preceding 20 years, there had been steady growth year after year, and he questioned Marx's perspective that the contradictions of capitalism would sharpen. And he theorized that the end goal of socialism was no longer even necessary to overcome the contradictions of capitalism, and that therefore the movement should just focus on winning practical victories in the here and now. The way he phrased it was that the final goal is nothing, the movement is everything. And this tendency, which is fundamentally opposed to Marxism, was growing at an alarming rate within the SPD, and especially its leadership. And in particular, this tendency actually wanted a socialist movement that was tied to nationalism, in which the standard of living of the German workers was linked to the prosperity of German capitalists and the expansion of German imperialism. Because Germany's industrial development was taking place in a period when the riches of the world were nearly all shared out, and German imperialism was denied the advantage of having these external safety valves in the form of markets in the colonial empires, which other powers like France and Britain dominated. Really, the world had become too small for the growth of capitalism, and war was the only way to decide on its redivision. And so war was what the German ruling class wanted. So from the beginning of the 20th century, the choice really was between world revolution or world imperialist war. And some in the internationalist socialist movement, they understood this very well, like Lenin and also Rosa Luxemburg, who actually jointly carried a resolution to the 1912 Congress of the Socialist International, in which they outlined the task of the International in the case of the outbreak of war. Their resolution read, "If war is declared, the working classes in the countries affected, as well as their parliamentary representatives, have the duty to mobilize their forces to prevent hostilities from breaking out. If, in spite of their efforts, war should break out, their duty is to struggle actively for a speedy end to the fighting and to make every effort to use the economic and political crisis which the war causes to rouse the people, and in this way to speed up the abolition of the rule of the capitalist class." And on paper, the SPD and its leaders, they abided by this resolution, continued to speak in very revolutionary language. But in practice, really all of the leaders of the European socialist parties did very little to halt the coming conflict. And so on the 1st of August, 1914, the German government declared war on Russia and proclaimed a state of emergency. Now, fighting against the war would have seen the SPD and its organizations declared illegal and forced what remained of the party underground. And this was something that the apparatus of the SPD was unwilling to do. And so through the mouths of the right-wing Social Democrats, the German bourgeoisie offered a very attractive solution in the form of the survival of the party organizations and their becoming an official part of the state so that civil peace could be maintained in the face of the external danger. On the 2nd of August, the executive of the German SPD met to define the attitude of its parliamentary deputies on the question of voting for the war credits, the funding of the war. And a heated debate broke out, with the right-wing leaders firmly arguing for a vote with their own national bourgeoisie and for the war, and a number of individual left-wing leaders arguing for a vote against, in line with the principles of the party. But these left-wingers, they didn't really have any common program, and they had no plan for really how to wage a struggle against the war. And so the majority of the hesitant deputies in the middle were won over by the right. And there were 14 deputies who wished to vote against the war, but the grip of party unity was so powerful that none of them broke discipline. And so the SPD voted as a bloc for the war. And this was a crushing betrayal of the working class, which almost no one had foreseen. And the terrible pressure of the news media, the state apparatus, and generally this hysterical mood of chauvinism that was created a really irresistible current. And not having been accustomed to isolation, to struggling against the stream, and still less to the repression and the conditions of illegality, the SPD apparatus really succumbed to this. The trade unions made an agreement with the employers that there were to be no strikes or lockouts for the duration of hostilities, and that collective agreements would be extended over this period. And soon the social democratic leaders became as annexationist as the military chiefs. They assured the German workers that the Kaiser's army was actually defending the prospects of socialism when it fought against the Russian Tsar and British imperialism. Meanwhile, in France, the socialists declared that German militarism had to be destroyed if the possibility of socialism was to be ensured, and so on. And so the Socialist International died on the 4th of August in 1914. And really within the International, there was very little opposition. Amongst notable figures, only the Bolsheviks in Russia, Connolly in Ireland, Maclean in Scotland, a couple of the Italian socialists, and Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Germany stood against the tide. Karl Liebknecht was by far the most prominent internationalist in Germany. And around him, I would say the equivalent of a Bolshevik current would come to crystallize in Germany. He was a lawyer and a militant youth organizer, and he particularly championed the struggle against militarism, which had earned him a sentence of 18 months imprisonment and really made him the symbol of the socialist struggle against the army, as well as the most hated symbol of the nationalists. There were a couple of other notable figures, but really no one inspired as much respect and on occasion also fear and hatred in the leadership of the party and the trade unions as the woman who was regarded as one of the great theoreticians of the movement, Rosa Luxemburg. She had been born to an impoverished Jewish family in Poland, was won to socialism when she was very young, and actually helped to found and lead the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania. She went on to play an important role in Warsaw during the Russian Revolution of 1905, which also earned her many months in prison. But it was really through her activity in the German social democracy, and particularly her participation in the great theoretical debates, that Luxemburg won her reputation, her friends, and also her enemies. And her name is really inseparable from the history of the Bernstein affair and the theoretical struggle against revisionism and in defense of Marxism, during which she published her famous pamphlets, Reform or Revolution. And after the betrayal of the SPD leaders on the evening of the vote for the war credits, Rosa held a meeting in her apartment to discuss what to do and to publish a statement letting the world know that not all German social democrats supported the chauvinist policy of its leaders. But this was a very small group. I mean, they fit in one apartment. I can't imagine that Berlin apartments are much bigger than Montreal ones. But the group also resolved to publish a paper called the Internationale. But this was not a paper in like a Leninist sense. It wasn't intended to be a national organizer, to serve as the scaffolding of some sort of a party organization. It was intended solely to influence the members of the local party organizations of the SPD. But nevertheless, these were really the only people at the beginning of the war putting forward a clear internationalist position against the imperialist war and the need to turn it into a struggle for socialist revolution. But I mean, the situation must have seemed quite bleak. Again, the entire International had just betrayed, and the only remaining internationalists fit in a single flat. But in the words of Trotsky, the molecular process of revolution was hard at work within the ranks of the working class. Public expenditure during the war was financed purely by inflation. The price of food rose by 50% in the first 2 years, while wages remained static. And soon everyone's earnings tended towards a minimum diet, which itself was endangered by rationing and shortages. And the overcrowded hospitals, the spectacle of thousands of mutilated young men, the ever-lengthening lists of dead and missing, all of this put an end to the illusions of a quick and honorable war which the SPD leaders had encouraged. There had also been no strikes since the outbreak of the war, but this was not due to an unwillingness of the workers to fight. When they were really under pressure from both sides, any strike or demonstration was forbidden by the government, the party, and the unions alike. And in a situation like this, the role of leadership is decisive. And so resistance to the war really only found expression where groups of revolutionaries controlled sectors of the SPD apparatus or held positions in the press, and where an organization, or at least part of one, could express the opposition of the masses. And the left in the SPD was really to be found in these militant workers, trade union activists, and party members who represented, if you will, the organic cadre of the working class, and which gave the SPD leadership an increasingly hard time by organizing wildcat strikes and disruptions. And the pressure of the working class also made itself felt on the parliamentary deputies. In the Reichstag, which is the German parliament, on the 3rd of December, the German government held a vote for new war credits. And this time, Liebknecht, who had now joined Rosa's group of internationalists, he alone voted against the war credits. And in this way, he made himself really the symbol of the struggle against the war. In the trenches of soldiers in France, in Russia, the name of Karl Liebknecht became synonymous with the revolutionary courage to stand up against the war. And very quickly, more discontent was to follow. By March, 25 SPD deputies voted against the renewal of war credits, and many others walked out in protest. And in general, the tide was clearly starting to turn. But this small group around Rosa and Liebknecht, they were not prepared to tap into this. They also had other issues. Luxembourg had been imprisoned for several months for one of her pamphlets that had insulted the Kaiser. And during her prison sentence, she would anonymously publish what was called the Junius pamphlet, which Lenin hailed as the first coherent criticism of the policy of the SPD and the war. He said, "The Junius pamphlet has undoubtedly played and will play an important role in the struggle against the ex-Social Democratic Party of Germany, which has deserted to the side of the bourgeoisie and the Junkers, and we heartily greet the author." But that having been said, Lenin also had criticisms of it because it did not actually take the step of acknowledging that what was needed was a break from the SPD officialdom in order to free the masses of German workers from their influence. Lenin goes on to say, "A very great defect in revolutionary Marxism in Germany as a whole is its lack of a compact, illegal organization that would systematically pursue its line and educate the masses in the spirit of the new tasks." Now, in January of 1916, the Internationale group kind of got together with a lot of these other left-wingers, and they founded what was called the Spartacus League, which is named after the leader of the great slave uprising in the Roman Empire. Now, some in the group argued for organizing an open faction or even of splitting from the SPD, but Rosa rejected the proposal of a split, fearing that it would actually isolate the revolutionaries from the mass of the workers and lead only to the founding of an isolated sect. And Rosa's perspective was accepted, and so the Spartacists decided to stay within the SPD and to try to win over the rest of its membership from within. But they were really limited in how well they could do this because they continued to function as essentially a loose-knit propaganda group that would circulate leaflets and pamphlets. They had a leadership in Berlin, but this leadership had a very weak connection to the cadres on the ground, and it really acted mostly as a sort of post office. And this lack of political centralism would have consequences. Because within the mass of the SPD, things were heading for a split regardless of what the revolutionaries desired. The pressure of the working class was forcing larger and larger layers of the SPD to defect to the opposition. And a lot of these, deputies and activists, they based their resistance to the war not so much on revolutionary Marxism, but on many cases on a sort of pacifism. A resistance to the war more on legal or moral grounds. And they really just wanted things to go back to how the SPD was before the war. One such figure, Hugo Hasse, made a passionate speech in the Reichstag in May of 1916, and a group of 33 delegates voted with him against the party. And the SPD immediately expelled these delegates, and so they began to organize separately. And again, these pacifists, they didn't necessarily agree with the Spartacus League that only a socialist revolution could end the war. But the repression of the SPD executive pushed the two factions together. And in January of 1917, they held a national conference of the opposition to agree on measures to be taken to defend members against expulsion and to protect their newspapers from seizure. And in response, the SPD executive declared that the opposition had placed itself outside of the party by holding this conference and moved to expel every last oppositionist. And they did this where they could, but if there was a local organization where the oppositionists held a majority, the executive would simply expel the entire local organization as a whole. 91 organizations were expelled in this way, which included the overwhelming majority of the activists in Berlin, Leipzig, Bremen, and Brunswick. And in this way, the party was basically cut in half. About 170,000 members stayed with the old party, and the new party claimed a membership of about 120,000. And this split, which could have had a clarifying effect on the working class in drawing clear lines of demarcation between the revolutionaries and the reformists, was instead this murky mess of pacifists, opportunists, and revolutionaries. Within this new party, which gave itself the name of the USPD, or the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, you could find the leaders of every tendency of the workers' movement. You had Liebknecht in Luxembourg, but also the pacifists, Hase and Ledebour, and also the opportunists like Kautsky, and even Bernstein joined this new party. And so this was the state of things in Germany when the Russian Revolution broke out. And this posed even more starkly the questions facing the German movement. Above all, the activity of the Russian workers and peasants served as an example to their German counterparts. Not only did this show that a victorious revolution was possible, but it showed that a revolution would end the slaughter of the war. Under the names of Lenin and Trotsky, the Soviet regime also offered its help by all possible means, including money, to the international left wing of the workers' movement. More than 60,000 leaflets were smuggled into Germany in the summer of 1917 alone. By way of Stockholm and Switzerland, several thousand copies of The State and Revolution arrived in Germany. And when the peace negotiations between Germany and Russia began at Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky was able to use the discussions as a platform from which the Russian workers called for help to their brothers and sisters in the warring countries. And this call was heard. On the 14th of January, a strike broke out in the Weiss arms factory in Budapest. Within a few days, it had spread to all of the industrial enterprises in Austria and Hungary, and in Germany as well. Strikes spread from factory to factory, and a call was even made for a general strike and mass demonstrations in Berlin. And the Russian Revolution also had a dramatic effect within the army, and especially in the Navy, because Navy sailors needed to be skilled with machines, and so they would often be recruited from the centers of working class organizing in the big factories. And these young petty officers and sailors saw in the Russian Revolution the road that led to peace. And so they began by utilizing canteen committees on the ships that had been set up to let the sailors plan meals and ration food, to organize themselves in what they themselves described as the first steps towards constructing sailors' councils on the model of the Russian Soviets. Now, these first attempts at Soviets were fairly short-lived, but they showed that there was a real storm brewing within the German movement. And by the fall of 1918, it was clear that the German army was on the brink of defeat. And so in October of 1918, the crews on some of the naval vessels anchored at Wilhelmshaven decided to move into action. An order had been given to prepare to go to sea, which gave rise to the rumor that the general staff was preparing to make a last stand to defend its honor in the North Sea. And these sailors did not want to die for the honor of their generals, and so they mutinied. And sensing the danger of being court-martialed, they also appealed to the workers on land for help. And that night, the whole of the garrison was organized in a network of sailors and soldiers' councils. The red flag floated over the naval vessels, and many officers were arrested by their men. On shore, the USPD and the SPD, under the pressure of the movement, jointly called for a general strike and then for workers' councils to be formed, which would fuse with the sailors' councils. And from there, the movement spread like wildfire. In city after city across Germany, the need for workers' and soldiers' councils found an expression. The author, Evelyn Anderson, who was there, gave this account. She said, "During the first days of the November Revolution, workers' and soldiers' councils were elected in all workshops, mines, docks, and barracks. The people were in motion. Wherever crowds assembled, they nominated spokesmen and elected delegates who were to speak and act on behalf of their direct representatives." And this happened all over the country. And these workers' councils now dispensed orders, directives, instructions, and really not a wheel turned, not a whistle blew without their say-so. It was like a strike, but on a truly massive scale. And this revolution, it really swept over the heads of all of the leaders of the different tendencies of the workers' movement, and they scrambled to catch up to it. The old SPD had actually felt the approach of this storm more acutely than anyone else. These reformist leaders who had fully made their peace with capitalism, they did not want the revolution. And so they had actually been calling on the Kaiser for some time now to abdicate and to hand power to a provisional government which would be led by the SPD. And their goal was to try to save the situation by diverting the revolution through reforms from above. And by getting the Kaiser to abdicate, they wanted to keep the movement within the boundaries of really only a bourgeois or a democratic revolution, and not let it go all the way to the workers taking power. One of the SPD leaders said the following. He said, "The problem is to resist the Bolshevik revolution, which is rising, ever more threatening, and which means chaos. The imperial question is closely linked to that of Bolshevism. We must sacrifice the Kaiser to save the country." But the thing is, the SPD was also starting to lose control. It's really the nature of a revolution that the masses impose their own will on events. And so that evening, the delegates of the SPD in the factories of Berlin reported to the party leaders, and they stated unanimously that in every factory, the workers were ready to act and that there could no longer be any question of holding them back. Workers' and soldiers' councils had been elected all over the country, the prisons had been attacked and opened, and the red flag, the emblem of the world revolution, hung over the public buildings. And so the SPD was forced into a position of accepting the rule of these new councils, and they began to actually consciously fight for influence within them. And this opened up a period that was very similar to what happened in Russia after the February Revolution. The old government had not yet been deposed. It continued to function through the leadership of the SPD, also in a coalition with the USPD. But the power of the government was now counterbalanced by the power of the workers' and soldiers' councils. And this is a situation described by Marxists as dual power, and it cannot last for any extended period of time. The situation has to be resolved either with the collapse of the workers' councils or with the smashing of the state apparatus and the workers' councils themselves becoming the organs of a new workers' state that can then expropriate the capitalists and begin the transition to socialism. And this was the perspective which the Bolsheviks argued for in the Soviets of Russia, after the February Revolution, and one in which they eventually, through patient explanation, won over the majority of the working class to their program. Now, in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht had been freed from prison by the November Revolution to great celebration. And the Spartacists represented a real revolutionary Marxist tendency that could connect with the masses of workers that were moving in their direction. But again, what they lacked was both a central organization that could coordinate a struggle for power within the Workers' Council, and they also lacked a connection to the organic cadres of the working class, which had now been elected to many of the positions within the councils. These layers within the councils were quite confused, actually. And while they represented the conscious striving of the working masses to make the revolution, they were also under the influence primarily of the USPD, which had put forward a position of support for the government. And the result was that no force within these newly founded workers' councils was able to coherently express the revolutionary potential that they possessed, to give the workers confidence in their own strength, and to argue against the other socialist leaders for the seizure of power by the workers directly, as they had in Russia in October. And so the SPD seized on the initiative that had been missed by the revolutionaries, and they began to campaign instead for a constituent assembly that would be based on all of the social classes of Germany to resolve the fate of the revolution. And facing no real organized opposition, they were largely successful in this campaign. And they actually convinced the workers' councils to disband themselves and to wait for a constituent assembly to elect a new government. And this repulsed many of the most radical layers of the working class, and especially the youth, who started joining the Spartacus League in droves. And these layers were really sickened by the counter-revolutionary activity of the SPD leaders, and they were inspired by the heroic victory of the Russian Revolution. But they really knew nothing about the real experience of Bolshevism. All they saw was the method of armed insurrection of October, counterposed to the parliamentary cretinism of the SPD and the USPD. And this led to this growing demand for what I would describe as an ultra-left position of boycotting the elections for the Constituent Assembly. This sort of ultra-leftism, as history has shown us again and again, is really the price that the working class has to pay for reformism. It's in a sense a very healthy reaction against the opportunism and chauvinism of the reformists, but it also has a bit of this childlike impatience to it that can lead to very dangerous mistakes if revolutionaries are not inoculated against it. And in this case, boycotting the elections for the Constituent Assembly would prove to be a fatal mistake. You see, what happens in a revolution, this happened in Russia, it happened in Germany, it's been happening today in Indonesia, in Nepal, Madagascar, is that a revolution awakens all layers of the population, not just the most radicalized. It awakens all of these people who have never been political before in their life. And they have to learn through their own experience. They have to test the reformists who offer them easy solutions. And in Germany, to a lot of these people, the SPD, which had won a majority in the workers' councils and which had been brought into government, basically was the revolution, right? They were unable to understand what the revolutionaries understood, right, about the counter-revolutionary nature of its leaders. And again, this is why Lenin emphasized over and over again that the task of revolutionaries was to patiently explain, to patiently win over broader layers of the working class to their program by going shoulder to shoulder with them through the events of the revolution. Because how can you reach the masses in a situation like this? Again, in Russia, Lenin did not advise the Bolsheviks to immediately denounce the revolutionary government, to demand for it to be brought down. Instead, he levied positive demands on the socialists and government to fulfill the promises that they had made to the workers. The Bolsheviks put forward slogans like "down with the 10 capitalist ministers." And this put the onus on the socialists in government to reveal their counter-revolutionary nature to the masses, or to do as the masses wanted. And something like this was also the task of the revolutionaries in Germany. The SPD had won a temporary victory within the workers' councils when they called for the Constituent Assembly. And the task of the German revolutionaries was now to go through the electoral campaign with the working class and use every opportunity to expose the hesitation and the betrayal of the right-wing leaders, just as the Bolsheviks had done in Russia in the months between February and October. But again, these young Spartacist revolutionaries, they did not understand this method, and they were moving instead to actually isolate themselves from the rest of the class. And it was in this atmosphere of political confusion that the Communist Party of Germany, or the KPD, was founded. The Spartacists fused with several other small groups that had declared themselves communists in the spirit of the Russian Revolution. And this was an extremely young party. 3/4 of the participants at their founding Congress were younger than 30. And at this Congress, many of the fundamental questions, such as an orientation towards the trade unions, were not discussed at all, largely because each of these groups could not really come to a definite position and were battling against their own ultra-left membership. And Rosa Luxemburg was actually very angry in the face of the extremism of the majority of the delegates. At the Congress, she again pointed to the example of Russia. She made the point that the German Revolution had only just begun, while the workers of Russia had begun to learn already in 1905. And she argued that the masses in Germany had not had enough time to develop the power of their councils and were not ready to overthrow the Constituent Assembly. And so Rosa put forward this perspective of a patient electoral campaign. But this was rejected and completely went under in the enthusiasm of the delegates for street demonstrations and for open battles. And at the same time, a strike wave had started to develop in Berlin. And so the members of the KPD, they threw themselves into this to try to escalate it to the level of an insurrection. And the strike wave itself was actually an extremely promising sign, because the workers were beginning to phrase the demands of the revolution in their own class interests in a way that really made it impossible, the political games that so many of the SPD leaders had been playing. And if this had been allowed to develop, it would have inevitably pushed the revolution forward. The revolutionaries in this situation needed to be patient and not do anything rash. But the leaders of the SPD, they understood this impatience, and they would now try to provoke it. They saw that both the left of the movement and really increasingly the working class itself was divided. The USPD had just walked out of the coalition government, and for both the masses and their leaders, it was extremely unclear what the next step was. The masses were desperate to advance, but they had continuously been given mixed signals by the people that they looked to as leaders. And Trotsky actually makes the point in History of the Russian Revolution. He says, more than anything else, indecisiveness in their leaders exhausts the nerves of the masses. Fruitless waiting impels them to more and more insistent knockings at that door which will not open to them, or to actual outbreaks of despair. And in this moment, the counter-revolution found precisely what the revolutionaries lacked, which was a decisive leadership that was able to analyze the relation of forces and an instrument, a trained, disciplined force. At this point, there was no question of relying on the traditional army to restore order. Every division that they would send to Berlin would just crumble as soon as it came into contact with the revolutionary mood there. But some of the officers had foreseen this, and they'd been preparing. They had formed a free corps of volunteer light infantry, similar to those that had been formed in Russia to combat Bolshevism. And these free corps were really intended for civil war. They were organized, armed, and trained for this purpose. And this force was put under the command of a man named Gustav Noske, who was he's actually a Social Democratic deputy, an SPD member, but he was more than happy to play the role of the executioner. And now with this tool of reaction safely in their back pocket, the SPD decided to try and provoke the workers in Berlin. And they did this by firing the police director, a man named Eichhorn, who was a member of the USPD and who was seen by the workers of Berlin as their guy, that he would defend them against the counter-revolution that was increasingly circling like vultures. And in response to this, the left called for demonstrations. Rosa and the Zentrale, the Central Committee of the KPD, they were actually unanimous that these demonstrations needed to be of a restrained nature, that they needed to wait for the workers and the rest of Germany. If they had moved to seize power in Berlin, the counter-revolution would have been able to simply starve out the capital. But the protests that they called developed to such a scale that it surprised even the organizers themselves. The heart of the capital was occupied by hundreds of thousands of demonstrators, where from the balcony of the police headquarters, Liebknecht and Eichhorn acknowledged the power of the assembled workers and hailed this vast display of their determination. It was really clear that these advanced workers, they wanted the seizure of power. They did not have an understanding of the situation in the rest of the country, and they were sick and tired of waiting. And there's a remarkable similarity here to what happened in July 1917 in Russia. Because in Petrograd as well, the most advanced sections of the working class had demanded an immediate political showdown with the forces of the counter-revolution and to settle the question of power. And the role of the Bolsheviks here was actually to hold back these layers and to wait for this to be understood by the workers and peasants in the rest of the country. But in Germany, the leaders gave into this mood. On top of this, they also didn't really know what to do. They didn't have an apparatus. They didn't have a military organization through which a seizure of power was possible. And they were really just plagued by indecisiveness. And there's a great quote from an eyewitness as to what happened next. He says, "The masses were there very early, from 9 o'clock in the cold and the fog. The leaders were in session somewhere, deliberating. The fog grew heavier and the masses were still waiting, but the leaders deliberated. Midday came, bringing hunger as well as cold, and the leaders deliberated. The masses were delirious with excitement. They wanted action, something to relieve their delirium. No one knew what. The leaders deliberated. The fog grew thicker, and with it came twilight. The masses returned sadly homeward. They had wanted some great event, and they had done nothing. And the leaders deliberated. And so some of these frustrated detachments of workers and soldiers actually took their own initiative. They took over some of the newspapers that belonged to the SPD, and this led to direct fighting between groups of ostensibly socialist workers. And Karl Radek, who alone of the German communists had actually participated in the Russian Revolution, he used the example of the Bolsheviks in July and insisted that the German communist leaders had to call for a retreat. Because again, to the workers outside of the capital, as well as to the millions of workers who were still under the influence of the old SPD, this struggle would not have been understood. They saw only this fratricidal struggle between workers representing multiple parties, all claiming to be socialist, and their demand in that situation was for unity and for an end to the fighting. And had the Communist Party adopted Radek's proposal, it would have enabled them to avoid being blamed for the continued fighting, to draw into a necessary retreat the confused, also independents and other revolutionary delegates, and to isolate within the SPD only those who demanded this repression against the extreme left, who were the conscious allies of the counter-revolution. And it was in these conditions that Rosa seems to have finally understood the need for a revolutionary party. On the 11th of January, she wrote, "The absence of leadership, the non-existence of a center to organize the Berlin working class cannot continue. If the cause of the revolution is to advance, if the victory of the proletariat, of socialism, is to be anything but a dream, the revolutionary workers must set up leading organizations able to guide and to utilize the combative energy of the masses." But in the absence of such an organization, the Free Corps now marched into Berlin. And all of the conquered positions and newspaper offices that had been taken over were seized by the Free Corps, and captured workers were executed on the spot. And within a day, the movement had been crushed. And the Free Corps was now actively hunting the revolutionary leaders. Liebknecht and Luxemburg were specifically targeted, and they should have escaped the capital, like Lenin did after the July days in Russia, but instead they only consented to hide in the apartment of a sympathizer. And it was here that they were arrested by men that were under the command of Noske. And the next day, the Vorwärts, the paper of the SPD, announced in large headlines the news that Liebknecht and Luxemburg were dead, allegedly shot while trying to escape. The truth emerged over the next couple of days. The soldiers had clubbed and shot their prisoners to death. Liebknecht's body was deposited at the police station as an unidentified corpse, and Luxemburg's body was weighted down with stones and thrown into the canal, where it only resurfaced months later. And the consequences of this double murder are really incalculable. After this, there was always the blood of Liebknecht and Luxemburg between German Social Democrats and German communists. And the Young Communist Party was deprived simultaneously of its best political leader and its most prestigious spokesman. And it also convinced the revolutionaries that their only mistake had really been to procrastinate. And it would take several more months of cruel experience for the isolated German communists to learn that before you can seize power, you need to find a way to win the masses. But the fighting in January of 1919 in Berlin brought the first phase of the revolution to an end. Now, the German Revolution was not a single act, but actually a 5-year process of revolution and counter-revolution from 1918 to 1923. The KPD would indeed grow into a mass party, but one that had been decapitated of its most far-sighted leadership. And really nobody could replace the role that Rosa and Liebknecht had played. And the final revolutionary opportunity in 1923 was tragically missed due to bad advice from the Comintern leaders Zinoviev and Stalin. And the consequences of that failure would be brutally felt over a decade later with the rise of fascism in Germany. And likewise, the failure of the German Revolution all but guaranteed the isolation and the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, and the rise of Stalinism. So, where does all of this leave us? What should have gone differently in Germany? Well, I'll say alternative history only lets us speculate so far, but I think it's clear that things would have gone very differently had the revolutionaries around Luxembourg and Liebknecht taken steps earlier to organize as a distinct tendency with its own structures and organization. This would have allowed them to offer a principled critique of the policy of the SPD leaders and to clarify the real questions of the war. The layers of radical youth and workers that ended up joining the Spartacists, who supported the Bolshevik Revolution, could have been organized and educated through this organization with a firm orientation to winning over the rest of the class to their perspective. And such an organization would have allowed for the founding of the Communist Party on a sound theoretical basis and would have totally changed how the split within the USPD would have gone. It would have drawn a clear dividing line between the revolutionaries that stood for workers' democracy and the reformists who sought to suffocate the revolution. And it could also have started a process of clarification within the old SPD, peeling away the masses of workers within the old party from their counter-revolutionary leadership. But because it took so long for the Communist Party to be formed, and because it was formed in such a confused way, the differences between the socialist tendencies could never be truly clarified, and it allowed these reformist traitors to maneuver in their midst and to derail the revolution. And we should be clear that if Lenin did not have an understanding of this dynamic and prepared the ranks of the Bolsheviks well ahead of the outbreak of the revolution, the same thing would have happened in Russia. This is really the core lesson of the German and the Russian revolutions, and it's also the core lesson that we're building on today. I mean, we're preparing ourselves to play a very similar role to figures like Rosa and Liebknecht, thousands of other revolutionaries I did not have time to name. And I don't think anybody would argue that these figures did not have enough courage or tenacity or the vision to carry out this revolution. But all of these individual qualities are not enough. They can only find an expression and have an effect if they are channeled through a party organization, which has to be prepared in advance. And it's not an abstract question, but it's really our task here today.